The Letters I Never Sent. Chapter 1, Garden Thoughts. Margaret Chun sat on her back porch, watching the morning sun filter through the maple tree she and her late husband Tom had planted 30 years ago. The tree was full-grown now, its branches reaching toward the roof of her small house in Cedar Falls, Iowa. At 72, she still woke early, a habit from her 40 years of teaching third grade at Lincoln Elementary. But these days, instead of rushing to prepare lessons, she had time to sit with her coffee and think. The garden needed weeding. The tomatoes were coming in beautifully this year, better than they had in ages. She should call her daughter Susan in Minneapolis soon. These were the thoughts that usually filled her quiet mornings. But today, something else occupied her mind. Yesterday, while cleaning out the attic, she had found an old shoebox tucked behind Tom's winter coats. Inside were dozens of letters, all addressed to the same person, all in her own careful handwriting. None of them had ever been sent. Margaret took a sip of her coffee and smiled to herself. After all these years, she had forgotten about those letters. Well, not forgotten exactly. More like tucked them away in her heart the same way she had tucked them away in that old box. The letters were all addressed to David Hartwell. Chapter 2, The New Teacher. September 1975. Margaret adjusted the bulletin boards in her classroom one more time before the other teachers arrived. It was her third year at Lincoln Elementary, and she was finally feeling confident about her teaching. The alphabet border was straight, the welcome message was cheerful but not too childish, and she had arranged the desks in small groups rather than rows, something new she wanted to try. "Good morning, Margaret," called Principal Walsh from the doorway. "I'd like you to meet our new fourth grade teacher, David Hartwell." Margaret turned around and felt something flutter in her chest. David was tall and lean, with kind brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His hair was a little longer than most of the male teachers wore, and he had a gentle smile that made her think of her favorite college professor. "It's nice to meet you," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Margaret Chun." "The pleasure's mine," David replied, shaking her hand warmly. "Principal Walsh tells me you're the person to talk to about anything involving third graders. I figure some of my students will be yours next year." "Actually, some of yours were probably mine last year," Margaret said, then immediately worried she sounded presumptuous. "I mean, if you need any background on particular students, that would be wonderful. Maybe we could talk over lunch sometime this week." Margaret nodded, hoping she didn't look as flustered as she felt. After David left with Principal Walsh, she sat at her desk and tried to focus on her lesson plans. But her mind kept wandering to his smile and the way he had said, "The pleasure's mine," with such genuine warmth. That evening, she found herself writing in her journal more than usual, describing the new teacher and wondering if he was married. She didn't see a wedding ring, but that didn't always mean anything. Chapter 3, Coffee and Conversations. October 1975. "So how did you end up in Cedar Falls?" Margaret asked, stirring cream into her coffee. They were sitting in Millie's diner, the same place where she had eaten lunch almost every Friday since starting at Lincoln Elementary. "I grew up about an hour from here in Waterloo," David said. "After college and my stint in the Army, I wanted to come back to Iowa. There's something about small town schools that appealed to me. The kids here aren't just students, they're part of the community." Margaret nodded. She understood that feeling. Teaching in Cedar Falls meant knowing her students' parents, sometimes their grandparents. It meant seeing former students graduate high school and start families of their own. "What about you? Are you from here originally?" "Born and raised," Margaret said. "My parents ran Chen's Market downtown until they retired. I went to Iowa State for my teaching degree, thought about moving to Des Moines or maybe Chicago. But," she shrugged, "this place gets into your blood." David smiled. "I can see that already. Mrs. Henderson in the office told me you've never missed a school board meeting in 3 years. Margaret felt her cheeks warm. "I suppose that makes me sound like a busybody." It makes you sound like someone who cares." They talked easily after that. David told her about his students, about the reading corner he was setting up in his classroom, about his idea to start an after-school chess club. Margaret found herself sharing more than she usually did. Her ideas about teaching, her frustrations with the new state testing requirements, even her dream of one day writing children's books. "You should do it," David said when she mentioned the books. "Mrs. Patterson in the library says you have a gift for storytelling." "Oh, I don't know. It's just a silly idea." The best ideas often start out seeming silly. Walking back to school, Margaret felt lighter than she had in months. It had been so long since she'd had a real conversation with someone her own age, someone who understood the challenges and joys of teaching. Her parents were supportive but didn't quite understand why she had chosen to work with other people's children instead of having her own. Her few close friends from college had all moved away or gotten married and busy with their families. That night, she wrote her first letter to David, pouring out thoughts she couldn't quite bring herself to say in person. She wrote about how much she had enjoyed their conversation, how rare it was to meet someone who really listened, how she hoped they could become good friends. She sealed the letter, addressed it, even put a stamp on it, but she never mailed it. Chapter 4. The Chess Club. Spring 1976. David's chess club was a bigger success than anyone had expected. What started with 6 interested students had grown to 15, meeting every Tuesday and Thursday after school. Margaret often stayed late to work in her classroom and would hear the sounds of quiet concentration and occasional celebrations from down the hall. "You should join us," David suggested one afternoon as Margaret was locking her classroom door. "I could use another adult who knows how to play." "I'm not very good," Margaret protested, though she had learned the game from her father years ago and still remembered most of the moves. "Neither are half the kids, but they're having fun learning. Come on, just for a few minutes." Margaret found herself following David down the hall to his classroom, where students were hunched over chessboards in various states of concentration. Tommy Rodriguez, one of her former students, looked up and grinned. "Hi, Mrs. Chun. Mr. Hartwell, can Mrs. Chun be my partner? I want to show her the move you taught me last week." Before she knew it, Margaret was sitting across from Tommy, helping him work through a complicated position while David moved between the other boards, offering quiet suggestions and encouragement. She watched the way he interacted with the children, patient, enthusiastic, never making them feel foolish for their mistakes. "Your move, Mrs. Chun," Tommy said, and Margaret realized she had been staring. "Sorry, Tommy. I was thinking." After the students left, Margaret helped David put away the chess sets. "Thank you for staying," he said. "The kids love having you here. Tommy hasn't stopped talking about that endgame strategy you showed him." "It was fun," Margaret admitted. "I'd forgotten how much I enjoy the game. Does that mean you'll come back next week?" Margaret nodded, already looking forward to it. That evening, she wrote another letter to David. This one was about how watching him with the chess club had made her think about different kinds of teaching, about the way he brought out confidence in shy students, about how lucky Lincoln Elementary was to have him. Like all the others, she never sent it. Chapter 5. Summer Plans. June 1976. The last day of school always brought mixed emotions. Margaret loved her summers off, but she would miss her students and the daily rhythm of teaching. She was packing up her classroom when David appeared in her doorway. "Busy?" he asked. "Just the usual end-of-year chaos. What about you?" "Finished about an hour ago." "Listen, I wanted to ask you something." David stepped into her classroom, looking slightly nervous. "A group of us are going to the county fair next weekend. Sarah Mills, Jim Patterson, a few other teachers. Would you like to come along?" Margaret's heart jumped, but she tried to keep her voice casual. "That sounds nice. I haven't been to the fair in years." "Great. We're meeting at the school parking lot Saturday morning around 10. I can give you a ride if you'd like." I have my own car, but thank you. After David left, Margaret sat in her empty classroom and tried to understand the mixture of excitement and anxiety she was feeling. It was just a group outing with colleagues, nothing more. But the way David had looked slightly nervous asking her, the way he had offered to drive her, it felt like something more. That night, she wrote a long letter about how much the school year had meant to her, how much David's friendship had meant to her, and how she hoped they would stay close over the summer. She wrote about looking forward to the fair and spending more time together. She almost mailed that one. She carried it to the post office twice before finally bringing it home and adding it to the growing collection in her dresser drawer. Chapter 6. The County Fair. June 1976. The Cedar Falls County Fair was exactly as Margaret remembered from her childhood. The same mix of carnival rides, livestock shows, and food stands that made her feel wonderfully nostalgic. She met the group at the entrance, pleased to see that it was indeed several teachers and their spouses or dates, all except David, who was alone, and herself. Margaret. Sarah Mills waved her over. I'm so glad you could come. David, you were right. She did decide to join us. Margaret glanced at David, who was looking at his shoes with what might have been embarrassment. I hope you don't mind, he said quietly as the group headed toward the midway. I may have mentioned to Sarah that I was hoping you'd come. I don't mind at all. They spent the morning wandering through the exhibits. Margaret admired the quilts while David was fascinated by the antique tractor display. They shared a funnel cake and watched the pig judging contest, laughing at Jim Patterson's running commentary on the contestants. In the afternoon, the group split up. Sarah and her husband went to see the band competition. Jim and his wife headed for the horse show. Margaret found herself alone with David near the games of chance. Want to try to win me a stuffed animal? She asked, gesturing toward the ring toss game. I should warn you, I'm terrible at these things. That's okay. It's the thought that counts. David spent $3 trying to land rings on bottles, coming close several times but never quite succeeding. The teenager running the game took pity on him and handed Margaret a small stuffed bear anyway. A participation prize, he said with a grin. Thank you, Margaret said, tucking the bear under her arm. I'll treasure it. They rode the Ferris wheel as the sun was setting. The fairground spread out below them in a twinkling display of lights and movement. At the top, the wheel stopped for a few minutes. This is nice, David said, and Margaret turned to find him looking at her instead of the view. Yes, she agreed, her heart racing. It is. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her. He leaned slightly closer, and she found herself holding her breath. But then the wheel started moving again and the moment passed. Driving home alone later that evening, Margaret clutched the steering wheel and tried to sort through her emotions. Had she imagined the connection she felt? Was David just being friendly the way he was with everyone? Or had there been something more in the way he looked at her on the Ferris wheel? That night, she wrote one of her longest letters yet, describing every moment of the day and analyzing every conversation, every glance, every gesture. She wrote about the way her heart had raced when he almost kissed her, about how much she was starting to care for him, about how terrified she was of ruining their friendship by wanting something more. She sealed the letter and put it with all the others. Chapter 7. August Revelation. August 1976. Margaret was at the grocery store, debating between peaches and plums for her morning oatmeal, when she heard David's voice from the next aisle over. I think she'll love it, he was saying to someone. We looked at rings last weekend, and she kept going back to the simple ones. Nothing too flashy. Margaret's heart stopped. Rings. She moved closer to the end of the aisle, where she could just see David talking to Jim Patterson. When are you planning to propose? Jim asked. Soon. Maybe at the end of summer barbecue next weekend. I've been carrying the ring around for a week now, waiting for the right moment. Margaret quickly turned away. her hands shaking as she grabbed a bag of peaches without really looking at them. She made her way to the checkout line, her mind reeling. David was going to propose to someone. Obviously not to her, since she had no idea he was even dating anyone seriously. All those moments she had interpreted as something special. The long conversations, the chess club afternoons, the almost kiss on the Ferris wheel, had just been friendship. She had been foolish to think otherwise. At home, she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and tried to make sense of her feelings. She was hurt, certainly, disappointed, but underneath that was something she hadn't expected. A kind of fierce happiness for David. If he had found someone to love, someone who made him happy enough to propose, then she was genuinely glad for him. That evening, she wrote what she thought might be her final letter to David. She congratulated him on finding love, told him how much his friendship had meant to her, and wished him every happiness. She wrote about how she hoped they could continue to be friends and colleagues, and how she looked forward to meeting his fiancée. It was the most honest letter she had ever written to him, and like all the others, she didn't send it. Chapter 8: The Barbecue. August 1976. The end of summer barbecue was a tradition at Lincoln Elementary. Principal Walsh hosted it at his house every year, and most of the staff attended with their families. Margaret almost didn't go, but she realized that staying home would only make things more awkward when school started. She arrived fashionably late, hoping to blend into the crowd. David was easy to spot. He was standing near the grill with a young woman Margaret didn't recognize. She was petite and blonde, with a bright smile and an easy laugh. Margaret could see why David had fallen for her. "Margaret!" Sarah Mills appeared at her elbow. "Come meet David's fiancée. Linda, this is Margaret Chen, our wonderful third-grade teacher." Linda shook Margaret's hand warmly. "David has told me so much about you. He says you're the best storyteller at the school." "That's very kind," Margaret managed, glancing at David, who looked happier than she had ever seen him. "Linda teaches second grade over in Waterloo," David said. "We met through a friend of mine from college." "How lovely," Margaret said. "When's the wedding?" "Next June," Linda said, holding out her left hand to display a simple but elegant engagement ring. "We're hoping for a small ceremony, just family and close friends." Margaret spent the rest of the barbecue making polite conversation and trying to appear normal. She complimented Principal Walsh's potato salad, listened to Jim Patterson's fishing stories, and helped clear dishes when it was time to clean up. Driving home, she felt empty but also strangely relieved. The uncertainty was over. David was engaged to a lovely woman who obviously adored him. Margaret could stop wondering and hoping and analyzing every conversation. She could focus on being his friend and colleague, nothing more. That night, she took all the unsent letters out of her dresser drawer and read through them. Some made her cringe. She had been so transparent in her feelings, so hopeful about signs that weren't really there. Others made her smile, remembering the genuine joy she had felt in David's friendship. She considered throwing them away, but instead put them in an empty shoebox and tucked them in the back of her closet. Someday, she thought, they might be an interesting reminder of this chapter in her life. Chapter 9: Moving Forward. Fall 1976, Spring 1978. The school year began with the usual excitement and chaos. Margaret threw herself into her work with renewed energy, developing new lesson plans and starting the children's book she had talked about with David. She joined the local book club, started volunteering at the library on weekends, and even went on a few dates with a nice man from her church. David and Linda were married in June of 1977, a beautiful ceremony at the Methodist Church in Waterloo. Margaret attended with several other teachers from Lincoln Elementary. She bought them a lovely serving platter and wished them well with complete sincerity. Linda was as wonderful as she had seemed at the barbecue, warm, funny, and clearly devoted to David. She and Margaret became friendly, bonding over their shared love of teaching young children. Sometimes Linda would stop by Lincoln Elementary after school, and she and Margaret would chat about classroom management techniques or difficult parents. "I'm so glad David has you as a friend," Linda said one afternoon. "He speaks so highly of you, and I can see why. You're exactly the kind of person I hoped he'd work with." Margaret smiled and meant it when she said, "I'm glad he found you, Linda. You two are perfect for each other." And they were. Margaret could see it in the way David's face lit up whenever Linda appeared, in the way Linda looked at him during staff parties, in the easy affection between them. Whatever Margaret had felt for David, infatuation, crush, the beginning of love, it had been one-sided. What David had with Linda was real and mutual and lasting. Margaret finished her first children's book that spring, a story about a little girl who befriends the new student in her class. Principal Walsh read it and encouraged her to send it to publishers. To her amazement, the third publisher she tried accepted it for publication. "This is wonderful news," David said when she shared the news in the teacher's lounge. "I always knew you had talent for this." "Thank you," Margaret said. "I'm not sure I would have tried it if you hadn't encouraged me that day at Millie's Diner." Sometimes we all need a little encouragement to chase our dreams. Chapter 10, New Beginnings. 1979 to 1983. Margaret's book was published in the fall of 1978, and while it wasn't a bestseller, it sold respectably and received nice reviews. More importantly, it opened doors. She began getting requests to speak at libraries and schools about writing for children. A small publisher in Iowa City commissioned her to write 3 more books. In 1979, she met Tom Chun, no relation despite the shared surname, at a book signing in Cedar Rapids. He was a widower with 2 grown children, recently retired from his job as a high school English teacher. He had come to the signing because he was thinking about writing his own book, a memoir about his experiences teaching in inner-city schools. Their friendship developed slowly and comfortably. Tom was steady and kind, with a dry sense of humor and a passion for gardening that matched Margaret's love of flowers. He was nothing like David, shorter, quieter, more practical, but he was reliable and caring, and he thought Margaret was remarkable. "I love how your mind works," he told her one evening as they sat on his back porch, discussing her latest book project. "You see stories everywhere." "I suppose I do," Margaret said, surprised to realize it was true. They were married in the summer of 1981, a small ceremony in Margaret's parents' backyard. David and Linda attended, and Margaret felt nothing but happiness as David congratulated her and Tom on finding each other. "I'm so happy for you," David said, shaking Tom's hand. "Margaret deserves someone wonderful." "I'm the lucky one," Tom replied, and Margaret knew he meant it. Chapter 11, Full Circle. Present day 2024. Margaret finished her coffee and went inside to get the box of letters from the kitchen table where she had left them the night before. 48 years later, they seemed like artifacts from another life. The handwriting was definitely hers, but the feelings described seemed to belong to someone else. Someone younger and more romantic, someone who still believed in fairy tale endings. She and Tom had been happily married for 41 years before his death 2 years ago. David and Linda had raised 3 children and just celebrated their 47th wedding anniversary. Margaret had published 12 children's books and mentored dozens of young teachers. David had become principal of Lincoln Elementary and then superintendent of the school district before his retirement. They had remained friends throughout the years, not close friends, but comfortable colleagues who genuinely cared about each other's welfare. Margaret had been there when David's father died. David had spoken beautifully at Tom's funeral. They exchanged Christmas cards and asked about each other's health and grandchildren. Margaret opened one of the letters at random and read her younger self's analysis of a conversation she and David had shared about teaching philosophy. The earnestness made her smile. She had been so serious about everything then, so convinced that every interaction had deep meaning. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. "Hello, Margaret?" This is Linda Hartwell. Margaret felt a flutter of surprise. She and Linda spoke occasionally, but usually only around holidays or special occasions. Hello, Linda. How are you? I'm well, thank you. Listen, I'm calling because I have a favor to ask. David's 75th birthday is next month. And I'm planning a small party. Nothing fancy, just family and a few close friends. I wondered if you'd like to come. Margaret hesitated for just a moment. That's very thoughtful of you to invite me. I'd be delighted to come. Wonderful. It's Saturday the 15th at 2 o'clock, here at our house. Oh, and Margaret? I'm putting together a little memory book for him, with notes from friends and colleagues about their favorite David stories. Would you consider writing something? After hanging up, Margaret sat quietly for a long time. She could write about David the teacher, or David the principal, or David the chess club sponsor. She could share a funny story about a school board meeting, or a touching moment with the student. Instead, she found herself reaching for a pen and paper. For the first time in nearly 50 years, she wrote a letter to David that she planned to send. Chapter 12, The Letter. Dear David, Linda asked me to share a favorite memory of you for your birthday book, and I've been trying to decide which story to tell. There are so many good ones from our years working together. Your patience with difficult parents, your innovative ideas for curriculum changes, the way you made every student feel capable and valued. But the memory I keep coming back to happened during your first year at Lincoln Elementary. It was October, I think, and we were having lunch at Millie's Diner. You asked me about my dream of writing children's books, and when I said it was probably just a silly idea, you told me that the best ideas often start out seeming silly. That conversation changed my life. Not just because you encouraged me to pursue writing, though that was important, but because it was the first time in a long while that someone had really listened to me, really seen who I wanted to be rather than just who I was in that moment. You've spent your whole career doing that for people. Students, teachers, parents, seeing their potential and helping them believe in themselves. It's a rare gift, and I wanted you to know how grateful I am that you shared it with me. I hope your 75th year brings you continued health, happiness, and the satisfaction of knowing how many lives you've touched. With warm regards and birthday wishes, Margaret. Margaret sealed the letter and addressed it to David and Linda Hartwell. Then she drove to the post office and mailed it without hesitation. Back home, she sat on her porch and looked at the box of old letters. After a moment, she carried them to the fireplace Tom had built in their living room. One by one, she fed them to the flames, watching her younger self's hopes and dreams and romantic longings turn to ash. She felt no sadness watching them burn. Those letters had served their purpose. They had helped her process her feelings and eventually move past them. They had been part of her journey toward the life she was meant to live. The life she had lived fully and gratefully with Tom. The phone rang again as she was sweeping the ashes from the fireplace. Margaret? This is David. Her heart gave a small skip, the way it had 48 years ago. But now it was the pleasant flutter of an old, comfortable friendship. Hello, David. How are you feeling about the big birthday? Oh, you know how it is. Linda's making much more fuss than necessary. But I wanted to thank you for your note. It means a lot to me that you remember that conversation. It was an important conversation. For me too, David said quietly. You know, Margaret, I've always admired you. Your dedication to your students, your creativity, your willingness to try new things. I learned a lot from watching you teach. That's very kind of you to say. I mean it. And I'm glad we've been friends all these years. Good friends are a treasure. Yes, Margaret agreed. They are. After she hung up, Margaret went back to her porch with a fresh cup of coffee. The maple tree rustled in the breeze, and she could hear the neighbor's dog barking playfully at something in the yard. Her tomatoes needed watering, and she should probably call Susan this afternoon. These were good thoughts, peaceful thoughts. She was 72 years old in reasonably good health, with friends and family who cared about her. She had published books that children still read, taught students who were now adults with children of their own, loved and been loved by a good man for 41 years. She had also, for a brief time, felt the flutter and hope of unrequited love. It hadn't worked out the way her romantic younger self had imagined, but it had been real and meaningful in its own way. It had been part of her story. Margaret smiled and went inside to start her day. On her kitchen counter, next to her grocery list and the latest letter from Susan, was a blank sheet of paper. Maybe it was time to start working on that memoir she had been thinking about. She had, after all, lived a story worth telling. She picked up her pen and wrote. Chapter 1. The Letters I Never Sent. Outside, the maple tree she and Tom had planted together cast its shade over the garden where she had found so much peace. It was a good place to remember the past and plan for whatever came next.